The clerk laughed out loud when she spotted the old man's faded military ID. Her voice carried across the store, sharp and mocking, as she held the card up for everyone to see. The old man's hand trembled as he tried to slip the ID back into his worn wallet, his face flushing with quiet embarrassment. She wasn't done humiliating him yet. With a shake of her head, she whispered loud enough for the nearby customers, "Is this even real? Looks like someone's trying to pull a fast one." The crowd around them shifted uncomfortably, unsure where to look. What she didn't realize was that the young man in uniform standing just 3 people behind had witnessed the entire exchange. His eyes burned with quiet anger and respect as he stepped forward, reaching into his own wallet. What he pulled out stopped the clerk cold, a brand-new military ID, shining with pride. In that instant, she understood she had just mocked a hero, right there in front of the one person who truly knew his worth. Welcome to the Silent Ranks. Before we dive into this powerful story, tell us in the comments from which city in the world are you watching this video today. And if you believe stories of respect and recognition deserve to be shared, please hit that subscribe button to support our growing community. Your support means everything to us. The hardware store on Maple Street had been serving the same small Kansas town for 43 years. 3 generations of the Morrison family had run it, each one knowing their customers by name, remembering their children's birthdays, and never questioning when someone needed to put lumber on credit until payday. But that was before corporate bought them out 6 months ago. Now the aisles were reorganized with efficiency in mind, the old wooden floors were covered with industrial carpet, and the new employees were trained to follow policy manuals instead of treating people like neighbors. It was a Tuesday morning when Frank Delacroix pushed through the glass doors, a small piece of paper clutched in his weathered hand. At 72, Frank moved slower than he used to, his left leg stiff from an old injury that acted up when the weather changed. He wore the same clothes he'd been wearing for the past 5 years, clean but faded jeans, a plain blue button-down shirt that hung loose on his shrinking frame, and work boots that had seen better decades. His silver hair was combed neatly to one side, and despite the trimmer in his hands that had developed recently, he carried himself with the same straight-backed posture he'd maintained since his Army days 50 years ago. Frank had come in for a simple repair. The kitchen faucet in his small apartment had been dripping for weeks, keeping him awake at night with its rhythmic ping against the metal sink. He'd finally looked up the part number online at the library and written it down carefully on the back of an envelope. The replacement cartridge cost $18.67. With the military discount the old store had always honored, it would come to $15.93. Frank had exactly $16 in his wallet. The new clerk behind the counter was 22 years old and had been working at the store for exactly 3 weeks. Her name tag read Jessica in cheerful blue letters, and she carried herself with the confidence of someone who believed following rules was the same as being right. She had shoulder-length brown hair pulled back in a ponytail and wore the store's required polo shirt with pressed khaki pants. Jessica took pride in her efficiency, in knowing every policy code by heart, and in never making exceptions that might get her in trouble with management. When Frank approached the counter with his small cartridge package, Jessica smiled the practiced smile she'd learned in retail training. She scanned the barcode and announced the total with crisp professionalism. Frank nodded and reached for his wallet, pulling out the military ID he'd carried for over 5 decades. The plastic was yellowed with age, the corners worn soft from years of handling, and the photograph showed a young soldier with dark hair and confident eyes that seemed like they belonged to a different person entirely. "I'd like to use the military discount, please," Frank said quietly, sliding the ID across the counter. Jessica picked up the card and immediately noticed the expiration date. She turned it over, examined both sides, then looked up at Frank with the expression that shifted from professional courtesy to barely concealed amusement. The ID had expired in 1989, over 34 years ago. In her 3 weeks of training, she'd been specifically instructed about expired identification and the importance of following corporate policy without exception. "Sir, this ID is expired," she said, her voice carrying a tone that suggested she was talking to a child who didn't understand simple concepts. "We can't accept expired identification for discounts. It's policy." Frank's face remained calm, but something flickered behind his eyes. He'd heard those words before, at other stores, from other young clerks who looked at his old ID and saw only bureaucratic inconvenience. "Ma'am, military IDs don't really expire in the same way. I served my country for it." Jessica cut him off with a laugh that was too loud for the quiet morning store. "Sir, look at this thing. 1989? I wasn't even born yet. For all I know, you could have found this in a parking lot. She held the ID up higher, angling it so other customers could see. I mean, seriously, who keeps an expired ID for 34 years unless they're trying to scam free discounts? The store wasn't crowded, but the few customers shopping in nearby aisles had started to notice the commotion. An elderly woman selecting paint samples glanced over with concern. A middle-aged man comparing drill bits paused to listen. Near the entrance, a young soldier in Army combat uniform had just walked in, still adjusting his eyes to the indoor lighting after being outside in the bright Kansas sun. Frank's hand trembled slightly as he reached for his ID, but Jessica wasn't finished. She was enjoying herself now, the power of policy backing her up, the satisfaction of catching someone trying to pull one over on corporate retail. And honestly, even if this was real back in the 80s, what did you do? Sit behind some desk filing paperwork? The real heroes are overseas right now, not trying to save $3 on plumbing parts with fake IDs. The words hit Frank like physical blows. His jaw tightened, and for a moment, the careful control he'd maintained for decades wavered. The other customers were staring now, some with embarrassment, others with the uncomfortable fascination people have when witnessing someone else's humiliation. Frank's weathered hands closed into fists at his sides, then slowly relaxed. He'd learned long ago that some battles weren't worth fighting, especially when the person across from you had no idea what they were really talking about. Just ring it up at full price, Frank said quietly, his voice barely audible above the store's background music. But Jessica wasn't done. She was on a roll now, emboldened by what she perceived as Frank's defeat. You know what really bothers me? My boyfriend is deployed right now, actually serving, actually fighting, while people like you try to take advantage of benefits meant for real soldiers. It's honestly kind of disgusting. The young soldier near the entrance had been listening to the entire exchange while pretending to read a flyer about lawnmower maintenance. He was 24 years old, Sergeant First Class Marcus Williams, just back from his second deployment to Afghanistan and still adjusting to being stateside. Marcus was tall and lean, with close-cropped black hair and the kind of steady composure that came from having responsibilities far beyond his years. He wore his uniform with the unconscious pride of someone who'd earned every ribbon on his chest through experience rather than ceremony. Marcus had come into the store to buy a simple door handle for his apartment, but he'd been frozen in place since Jessica started talking. He'd seen the old man's military ID from across the store, had noticed the way Frank carried himself, the way he stood at attention even when being insulted. There was something familiar about the elderly veteran, something that nagged at the back of Marcus's memory like a half-remembered song. As Jessica continued her lecture about real service and fake veterans, Marcus found himself studying Frank's profile more carefully. The straight spine, the way his hands hung at his sides, the particular tilt of his head when listening to someone speak. And then, like puzzle pieces falling into place, Marcus realized where he'd seen that posture before. It was in a photograph hanging in the mess hall at Fort Campbell. A black and white image of soldiers from the 101st Airborne, taken sometime in the late 60s. Marcus had passed that photograph hundreds of times during his training, had listened to drill sergeants tell stories about the men in that picture, had memorized the names and faces of soldiers who'd become legends within the regiment. And unless he was mistaken, the old man being humiliated at the hardware store counter was one of those legends. Marcus walked slowly toward the counter, his combat boots silent on the carpeted floor. Other customers stepped aside without conscious thought, responding to something in his bearing that commanded respect without demanding it. Jessica was still talking, her voice growing more shrill as she warmed to her subject of stolen valor and ungrateful fake veterans. Frank stood motionless, taking the abuse with the same stoic endurance he'd once used to survive much worse things in much worse places. "Excuse me," Marcus said quietly, his voice cutting through Jessica's monologue like a blade through silk. Jessica turned toward him, and her expression immediately shifted. Here was a real soldier, she thought. Young, fit, in uniform, clearly just back from deployment based on the tan lines around his eyes and the way his uniform still held the stiffness of desert washing. This was the kind of service member she respected, not like the old man with his fake expired ID. "Oh, hi there," Jessica said, her voice suddenly warm and respectful. "Thank you for your service. Are you finding everything okay?" Marcus ignored her question and looked directly at Frank. For a long moment, the two men studied each other in silence. Frank's eyes showed confusion at first, then growing recognition as he took in the patches on Marcus's uniform, the airborne wings on his chest, the combat infantryman badge that indicated real experience in real fighting. "Sir," Marcus said, his voice formal and respectful, Would you mind if I asked your name and unit? Frank straightened slightly, responding to the military courtesy with automatic precision. Frank Delacroix, Sergeant First Class, 101st Airborne Division, 1st Battalion, 327th Infantry Regiment. The store went completely silent. Even the background music seemed to fade as Marcus's face went pale with recognition. He reached into his cargo pocket and pulled out his phone, quickly scrolling through photos until he found what he was looking for. He turned the screen toward Frank, showing him a picture of the same black and white photograph that hung in the mess hall at Fort Campbell. "Sir, is this you?" Marcus asked, pointing to a figure in the photograph. Frank looked at the image, and for the first time since entering the store, he smiled. It was a small smile, sad and proud at the same time. "That was a long time ago, son." Marcus turned to Jessica, who was watching the exchange with growing confusion and dawning alarm. She could sense that something significant was happening, but she had no context for understanding what it meant. "Ma'am," Marcus said, his voice still quiet but now carrying an edge that made everyone in the store stop what they were doing. "Do you know who you just called a fake veteran?" Jessica shook her head, suddenly feeling like she'd walked into the middle of a conversation in a language she didn't understand. Marcus looked back at Frank, then at the other customers who had gathered closer to listen. "This man is Sergeant First Class Frank Delacroix. In March of 1969, his squad was ambushed in the Aishau Valley. He was wounded twice but continued fighting for 6 hours while calling in air support and coordinating the evacuation of casualties. He personally carried 4 wounded soldiers to safety, making multiple trips through enemy fire." The store was absolutely silent now. Jessica's face had gone completely white, and her hands were shaking as she still held Frank's expired military ID. Marcus wasn't finished. He was awarded the Silver Star, 2 Bronze Stars with V device for valor, and 3 Purple Hearts. But more than that, he saved the lives of 19 men that day. 19 soldiers who came home to their families because of what he did. Marcus reached into his wallet and pulled out his own military ID, but instead of showing it to Jessica, he set it down on the counter and stepped back. Then he did something that made everyone in the store freeze in place. In full view of the customers, the staff, and Frank himself, Marcus came to attention and rendered a perfect military salute. "It's an honor to serve in the same regiment you served in, Sergeant Delacroix. Every soldier in the 101st knows your story. We just never expected to meet you buying plumbing parts in Kansas." Frank stood motionless for a long moment, his old eyes bright with unshed tears. Then, slowly, he straightened to his full height and returned the salute with the same precision he'd learned 54 years ago in basic training. His hand was steady now, the tremor gone, as if the simple act of being recognized had restored something in him that had been worn down by years of indifference. The salute lasted exactly 3 seconds, the way they'd both been taught. When they lowered their hands, Marcus stepped forward and extended his hand to Frank. "Thank you for your service, sir. And thank you for showing us what courage looks like." Frank took the offered hand, and for a moment, the 72-year-old veteran and the 24-year-old soldier stood connected across 5 decades of shared understanding. They both knew things that couldn't be explained to people who hadn't experienced them. They both carried memories that woke them up at night sometimes. And they both understood that respect wasn't something you demanded, but something you earned through actions that most people would never hear about. Jessica was crying now, quiet tears of shame rolling down her cheeks as she realized the magnitude of her mistake. She'd spent 20 minutes humiliating a genuine American hero, calling him a fake and a scammer, laughing at an ID that represented more courage and sacrifice than she could imagine. The other customers were staring at her with expressions ranging from disgust to pity, and she knew that this moment would follow her for the rest of her life. Marcus turned to address the small crowd that had gathered. "This is what a real veteran looks like. Not all of them are young. Not all of them talk about their service. Most of them just go about their lives, trying to fix their kitchen faucets and hoping people will treat them with basic human decency. They don't ask for parades or constant thank yous. They just want to be recognized as human beings who did their job when their country needed them." He looked directly at Jessica, his voice firm but not cruel. "That expired ID represents more real service than most people contribute in their entire lives. The fact that it's old doesn't make it fake. It makes it historic." Frank picked up his military ID from the counter, sliding it carefully back into his wallet. He pulled out $16 and placed it on the counter next to the faucet cartridge. "Just ring it up at full price, please. I don't need the discount." But Marcus reached over and gently pushed Frank's money back toward him. Then he pulled out his own wallet and placed a $20 bill on the counter. The discount is the least this store can do, sir. And I'd like to cover the difference. Jessica fumbled with the register, her hand shaking as she applied the military discount she should have given immediately. The total came to $15.93. She handed Marcus his change with trembling fingers, unable to meet his eyes or Frank's. Frank accepted the small bag containing his faucet cartridge, but before leaving, he turned back to Jessica. His voice was quiet, without anger or resentment. Young lady, I don't blame you for following policy, but I hope someday you'll understand that service to this country doesn't have an expiration date. The men and women who wore this uniform earned that respect for life, whether their ID is current or not. Jessica nodded, tears still streaming down her face. I'm sorry, she whispered. I'm so sorry. Frank nodded once, accepting the apology with the same grace he'd accepted her insults. Then he turned and walked toward the door, his back straight and his head high. Marcus lingered for a moment, looking around at the other customers who were still processing what they'd witnessed. Remember this, he said quietly. Remember that heroes don't always look like what you expect. They're not all young, they're not all in uniform, and they don't all have current paperwork. Sometimes they're just old men trying to fix their kitchen sinks, carrying memories the rest of us can't imagine. He followed Frank toward the door, catching up with him in the parking lot. Sir, I hope you don't mind me asking, but do you live nearby? Frank turned, surprised by the question. About 6 blocks from here. Small apartment above the used bookstore. Marcus nodded thoughtfully. I'm stationed at Fort Riley, about an hour from here. I come to town sometimes on weekends. Would it be all right if I stopped by sometime? I'd like to hear more about your service, if you're willing to share. Frank's face broke into the first genuine smile he'd shown in months. I'd like that, son. I'd like that very much. They shook hands again, and Frank walked slowly toward his old Honda Civic, his shoulders no longer carrying the weight of humiliation. Marcus watched him go, then returned to the store to buy his door handle. Jessica was still behind the counter, her eyes red from crying, her confidence completely shattered. I hope you learned something today, Marcus said as she rang up his purchase. I did, Jessica replied quietly. I really did. Word of what happened at Morrison Hardware spread through the small Kansas town with the speed that only small towns can achieve. By evening, half the population had heard some version of the story. By the next morning, it had reached social media, where it spread further. But the real impact was local and immediate. The store manager, when he heard what had happened, immediately called Frank to apologize and offered him a permanent 10% discount on all purchases, expired ID or not. The local American Legion Post invited Frank to be their guest speaker at their next meeting. The high school history teacher asked if he would talk to her students about the Vietnam War from a soldier's perspective. But perhaps more importantly, Frank was no longer invisible in his own town. People who had passed him on the street for years without really seeing him now nodded respectfully when they encountered him. The barista at the coffee shop learned his name and his regular order. The librarian set aside military history books she thought he might enjoy. Jessica kept her job, but she never forgot the lesson she learned that Tuesday morning. She requested additional training about military benefits and veteran services. She volunteered at the local VA hospital on weekends, and every time she saw an elderly customer with an old military ID, she treated them with the respect they had earned decades before she was born. Marcus kept his promise to visit Frank. Every few weeks, he would drive to the small Kansas town and spend Saturday afternoons listening to stories from a man who had seen history and helped shape it. They talked about military service, about coming home from war, about the challenge of readjusting to civilian life. Frank found in Marcus a bridge between his past and present, someone who understood both the weight of memory and the hope of moving forward. Sometimes Frank would show Marcus old photographs from his army days, pictures of young men who had faced impossible situations with ordinary courage. He talked about friends who hadn't made it home, about the arbitrary nature of survival, about the responsibility that came with being one of the lucky ones who got to grow old. And sometimes they just sat in comfortable silence, two soldiers separated by 5 decades but connected by something deeper than time. They understood that real courage wasn't about seeking recognition or demanding thanks. It was about doing what needed to be done, when it needed to be done, regardless of whether anyone would remember or care. The faucet in Frank's kitchen stopped dripping that night. It was a small repair, an $18 cartridge that took 5 minutes to install. But the impact of that morning at Morrison Hardware would last for years, rippling outward through a community that had been reminded of something important, that heroes live among us, often unrecognized. carrying their service quietly and asking for nothing more than basic human respect. In a world that often seems divided by differences, there are still moments when people come together around shared values of honor, service, and simple decency. That Tuesday morning in a small Kansas hardware store was one of those moments when a young soldier's recognition of an old veteran's sacrifice reminded everyone present that some things transcend age, politics, and time itself. The expired military ID that Jessica had mocked now sits in Frank's wallet next to a new friendship that will last for years to come. And somewhere in that small Kansas town, people remember the morning when they witnessed what respect looks like when it's given freely, without reservation, from one generation of warriors to another. Sometimes the most important battles aren't fought with weapons or won through violence. Sometimes they're fought with dignity, won through recognition, and remembered through the simple act of one person seeing another's worth when the rest of the world has forgotten to look. Frank Delacroix never asked to be called a hero that day. He just wanted to buy a faucet cartridge and go home. But in a moment when respect met recognition, when past service was honored by present gratitude, something powerful happened that reminded everyone watching what it means to truly support those who served. This story was brought to you by the Silent Ranks. Before we leave you today, here's our question. Have you ever known someone who never asked for recognition but deserved more than anyone else? Someone whose service or sacrifice went unnoticed until one moment when everything changed. Tell us in the comments what they meant to you and how their story deserves to be remembered. And if you think stories like this need to be heard, hit that subscribe button to support the channel. We'll see you in the next one.